He hit the boy.
Mhm. Just 3 words. That was it. That was the entire explanation an autistic child gave after watching a story, a research vignette, where someone was harmed.
Yeah.
And, back then, the researchers, they looked at that answer, this very direct echo from the story, and they marked it down. They actually coded it as a poor justification. It makes you think, doesn't it? How often does this happen? Maybe in a meeting, maybe just talking with someone. Someone uses the perfect phrase, maybe barred, maybe simple, gets right to the point. But they get overlooked. Instead, we listen to the person who sounds more, I don't know, abstract, verbose. So today, we're opening up a file, going back to 2005 actually, to do a kind of, well, an intellectual justice dive. Our mission here is to reread these old transcripts through a completely different lens and ask, what if that repetition, that echo, wasn't a sign of poor reasoning at all? What if it was actually proof of really high moral fidelity, precision even? We're challenging the frame they used back then, shifting away from this deficit model towards something called Gestalt language processing, or GLP. We want to look at the real ethical cost of misreading how someone communicates.
Yeah, that original framework was, well, it's quite narrow, wasn't it? The sources we looked at really highlight this long-standing habit in academia, this tendency to equate abstraction with, intelligence. So if you couldn't generalize, if you couldn't create some new abstract moral principle on the spot, you were basically seen as failing the test. They saw that repetition, the verbatim quote, as just parroting. Like maybe there wasn't much internal thought going on. But the argument we're exploring today, it turns that completely on its head. It suggests the child is doing something maybe even more rigorous than just abstracting. They're kind of pinning the moral truth to its source, using those borrowed words because they precisely capture the wrongness without watering it down in a general statement.
Okay, let's back up a bit first. Let's unpack the original study itself, the Grant study from 2005, because some findings were pretty solid, right? What did they actually do?
Right. It was a pretty standard setup for developmental psychology at the time. They showed kids these short stories, vignettes, where characters caused harm, and they tweaked things like, was the harm on purpose or an accident? Was it harm to a person or just, an object, property?
And the goal was to see if autistic kids had the same basic moral structure as neurotypical kids.
Exactly. And here's the really key finding, the part no one disputes. The moral judgments were totally intact. The autistic kids, their answers lined up perfectly with their peers. They knew intentional harm was worse than accidental. They definitely knew hurting a person was much more serious than breaking an object.
So the moral compass was steady, pointing true north, you could say. The judgment itself wasn't the issue. So where did the researchers find the deficiency? Where did they draw that line?
They drew the line squarely at the explanation, the why. They basically accepted the verdict, yes, this is wrong, that is less wrong, but they didn't accept the language used to justify it. The study specifically noted that autistic children, quote, tended to repeat story details, like our opening, he hit the boy, instead of giving what the researchers called principled justifications.
So wait, they acknowledged the moral sense was there, working correctly, but because the words used to express it weren't these abstract, generated sentences, they labeled the articulation itself as somehow impaired.
That's pretty much it. It seems almost paradoxical when you look back.
It really does. They confirmed the morality, then kind of undercut it by questioning the way it was expressed, simply because of its form.
It's almost a textbook case of mistaking the medium for the message.
Yeah.
And to understand why they did that, you really have to remember the intellectual climate back then in the mid-2000s.
Right, the dominant theories at the time.
Exactly. Theory of mind was huge. And executive function, or rather dysfunction, those were the main lenses for understanding autism. So if you seem to struggle with theory of mind, that sort of intuitive grasp of others' thoughts, or maybe had challenges with cognitive flexibility, things tied to executive function, then any difference in language, like repetition, was almost automatically interpreted as a cognitive failure, a symptom of those underlying issues.
So when the kids repeated story fragments instead of saying something like, well, it's wrong to intentionally hurt people, the conclusion through that specific lens was kind of simple.
Yeah, it pointed to them lacking, quote, higher-order reasoning capacities required to generalize. Repetition just equaled failure. Failure to innovate thought, maybe a failure in perspective taking.
It just sounds so neat and definitive, but kind of dismissive, too.
Well, it fit the prevailing model very well. The idea that repetition might actually be a positive communication strategy, a valid, even precise way to highlight what's morally important, that just wasn't really considered. It wasn't part of the design.
Okay, I need to push back slightly here, just for fairness. They were working with the science they had in 2005, right? Was it actual negligence or more like being limited by the paradigm they're in? Maybe they just hadn't recognized other ways language could work yet.
That's a really important distinction, yeah. I wouldn't argue negligence is more like paradigm blindness.
Hmm.
They weren't looking for a different kind of competence. They were kind of looking to confirm the model they already had. So when he hit the boy showed up, it didn't click as, a sophisticated way to flag the transgression. It just got logged, frozen in print, as the source puts it, as proof of what autistic kids couldn't do, not as evidence of what they were doing, very precisely. The tools they used just couldn't measure the accuracy of that echo.
Okay. And this is where the shift happens. This is where bringing in Gestalt language processing, GLT, changes everything. Suddenly, the repetition doesn't look like a lack anymore. Those borrowed words, they aren't empty echoes. They're actually containers carrying very specific, often complex meaning. But maybe we should clarify GLP a bit for listeners who aren't familiar. It's not super intuitive at first glance. So, as I understand it, a Gestalt language processor isn't necessarily failing at grammar, right? They're using whole chunks of language, Gestalts, maybe lines from movies, songs, things they've heard,
That's right.
to communicate meaning. Because breaking down language into individual words and recombining them grammatically isn't their primary mode yet. Is that roughly it?
That's a really good way to put it. They absorb language in these whole phrases, these chunks, often with a specific tune or emotional weight attached. And echolalia, that verbatim borrowing you mentioned, carrying words over exactly, that's seen in GLP as a typical developmental stage. It's a valid way to communicate meaning when generating novel sentences word by word isn't yet the main pathway.
Okay, so it's not random parroting. It's using known meaningful blocks of language.
Precisely. Think about it like this. Compare a general summary, an abstraction, to a super detailed, high-resolution photo. The researchers wanted the summary, the abstraction. But the child, using GLP, might give you the photographs instead. A perfect, precise capture of the moral event. He hit the boy. They're justifying their judgment by anchoring it right back to the story's own words.
Ah, that makes those examples in the source material click. Like the student who's asked why something was wrong, and instead of saying lying is bad, they say sharply, because he lied to his friend.
Yes, straight to the core. It's the most efficient, most accurate linguistic tool available to them for that specific infraction.
So connecting this back to the Grant study, the child wasn't trying and failing to create some abstract rule.
No. They were using the source material, the story itself, as their evidence. Their justification was the evidence, presented directly. It's an act of fidelity. They're recognizing the moral weight in the story and voicing it using the words that carry that weight most strongly. They were basically indexing morality using story fragments.
And the researchers, waiting for a generalized principle, just missed it. They
Yeah.
couldn't see the system at work.
They literally couldn't recognize it within their framework.
Okay, before we get into the ethical cost, which feels really significant here, can you revisit that spiral model you mentioned, this idea from GLP about how meaning accrues with repetition? That sounds fascinating, like the echo isn't static.
Yeah, it's not just repeating the same thing blankly. It's often described as recursive, like a spiral. The mind loops back to that core phrase, that gestalt, not because it's stuck, but as a method, a way to gather and deepen meaning. The repetition itself becomes the tool for analysis. The source suggests, for instance, that the first time the child uses "he hit the boy," it might simply name the core act, just state the fact.
Okay.
But the next time it's used, maybe in response to a follow-up question, it might bring forward the intent or the specific harm, the body, the pain, the impact.
So it layers up.
Exactly. And maybe later, uses incorporate more context, the relationship between the characters, power dynamics, consequences. The moral judgment holds firm because the specific words keep anchoring it back to the scene, accumulating detail and nuance with each return.
While the researchers were only counting brand new abstract sentences.
Right, they were measuring novelty and abstraction, so they missed the incredibly detailed, layered work the child was doing through fidelity.
Yeah.
Through sticking to the source text.
And that's where the ethical cost really hits home, isn't it? That inability to see the fidelity, the irony is still just, wow. The data showed the moral judgment was fine, stable. But the language difference made them basically say the moral sense itself was somehow partial or underdeveloped.
And that core mistake, mistaking medium for message, it has real-world consequences, huge ones. Think about it practically, outside of the lab, in a classroom, in therapy. If a child uses an echo, a perfectly relevant quote, and the adult immediately thinks, oh, that's just empty repetition, no real thought there, how does the adult respond?
Yeah, you'd probably trust their reasoning less, right? You might push harder for a different kind of answer, maybe correct them more.
Exactly. Less cognitive trust. More demands for translation into the expected format.
That daily cost. It's huge. Imagine being that kid. You know exactly why something is wrong. You state it perfectly using the words that capture it because he lied. And maybe you get marked down or told use your own words, while another kid who gives a vaguer, more generic answer gets praised.
You learn pretty quickly that your way of understanding and expressing morality only counts if you can translate it into someone else's approved language style. Analytic language, in this case.
And that feeling of being misunderstood, that constant need to translate, it chips away at your sense of agency, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It stacks up. How many autistic kids over decades have had their competence just completely obscured? Their moral clarity basically downgraded because their justice came out in echoes.
Every time that clarity is labeled noise or failure to generalize, it's like saying their ethical reasoning itself is invalid.
Which is why reframing this isn't just an academic exercise. It feels like an ethical correction. It's about saying loud and clear, language form does not equal cognitive absence.
Yeah. The responsibility isn't on the child to force themselves into an analytic box that doesn't fit. It's on us to recognize the communication path they're actually on and meet them there. Scaffold that.
And the final point the source material makes here is maybe the most pointed. It touches on the ongoing debates around GLP itself. You still hear critics sometimes saying, well, there's no real evidence for GLP. And the source argues quite powerfully that the evidence has been there all along. It was sitting right there in the transcripts of studies like Grant's, the very data used to argue against their competence. Those repeated phrases, those echoes, there were the signatures, mislabeled for decades as noise or failure.
Wow. Okay, let's bring it back one last time to that incredibly potent line, he hit the boy. Justice is in that line, isn't it? When you look through the GLP lens, it's condensed, it's precise, it's utterly exact. The child nailed the transgression, using the language that, for them, carried the most weight, the most detail, the most truth. We have to stop demanding abstraction as the only valid currency of intelligence or morality.
Yeah. The failure wasn't in the child's processing. It was, as the source says, a profound failure of listening.
So we want to leave you with a thought today, something to chew on, building from this critique. Think about your own world, your job, how you evaluate ideas, maybe even just conversations with family and friends. Where might we still be making this mistake? Mistaking fidelity, sticking closely to the source, the facts, the exact words for an absence of thought. Where are we demanding the big abstract summary when maybe a direct quote, a specific detail, an echo, actually holds the entire moral or intellectual core? What old frames, what assumptions about communication might you need to shatter to really hear the evidence that's probably already right there in front of you?